当美国正和伊朗在中东死磕的时候，哈佛的专家居然还在忽悠中美注定一战。今天来看看中国学者高志凯教授是怎么在剑桥当场打脸的。欢迎回来，我是小满。2026年这开年的局势真的是魔幻，大家每天刷新闻都是各种热战冲突，看得人血压飙升。就在这世界发高烧的当口，高志凯在剑桥辩论社直接向西方的地缘政治理论开炮了，什么修昔底德陷阱，什么新冷战，他一语道破。这都是别人单方面强加的幻想，我们压根儿就不陪你们玩。在核武器时代，面对一个到处点燃战火的现实，中国凭什么敢说和平是必然的？让我们来品一品今天这期视频。
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor to be back at the Cambridge Union debate. And my task is to propose the proposition that we are in the Cold War. But I will make this proposal on several preconditions. One is that this Cold War is very much one-dimensional as far as China is concerned. We just now listened to Mr. Christopher Steele. He discussed the Cold War in the framework of US versus Russia, and he made his conclusion mostly by analyzing dynamics between US and Russia. And Mr. Haig made his analysis mostly by analyzing China. So we need to compare apple and orange and orange. So allow me to focus on China. So if anyone says there is a Cold War between China and the United States, I say yes, I agree on several caveats. The first caveat is that this new Cold War is one-dimensional. It is imposed by the United States on China, and China refuses to accept this Cold War. Well, you know, a few years ago, the US President was US President Biden. I've called President Biden as a Cold War president and his government as a Cold War president. They pursued Cold War on an ideological basis. They want to whack China down, and China maintained its stability. China refused to fall into a trap of a Cold War with the United States. Now we have President Trump. We have different views as to what President Trump is, but he seemed to be magically changing the temperature of the Cold War, and to such an extent that it becomes a hot war. So the Cold War under Biden may be a hot war under Trump, and now he's very hot in pursuit of Iran with Israel. No one can call that war as a Cold War. It's a hot war. So we are now faced with hot and cold, cold and hot. It becomes a fever. So I think the world is at a very critical moment, a very dangerous moment of suffering from a big fever. War versus peace, peace versus war, Cold War or hot war, etc. So this is one-dimensional mostly. We need to look at what China is doing. China refused to be dragged into this Cold War. China refused to be dragged into a hot war. So China wants to maintain its stability no matter how much agitated you are, no matter whether you want to pursue a Cold War on ideological basis or a hot war for other reasons. So this is the difference between the Cold War we are now faced with, at least as far as China is concerned, versus the Cold War back in the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, allow me to make another point. I think some people in the United States have talked about destined for war again and again. Are they talking about destined for a Cold War? No. I think they are thinking about destined for a hot war. Very dangerous. So when we are talking about a Cold War, don't indulge in the fantasy that those who propose a Cold War will be limited to a Cold War. A Cold War may turn its face into a hot war. Now, I completely refuse that philosophy of destined for war scenario or the Thucydides trap theory, because I believe that theory was derived at by a very prominent professor at Harvard, and I went to Yale, sorry for that, who analyzed the cases of war they are all conventional wars, and he refused, or he didn't tell mankind, Americans, the Chinese, the British, the one truth which matters the most. If you apply destined for war scenario, most likely hot war, not cold war, you are indulging in a fantasy and fallacy, because you cannot simply analyze cases of conventional war and derive at your conclusion and try to apply that to China and the United States, which are two of the most important nuclear power. So I came up with my own theory, not to shock you. My theory is inevitability of peace between China and the United States. The United States is not in a position to impose a war on China. Hot war or cold war? No, they will not be able to do that. If they do that, they will not win. Therefore, my real proposition, I want to say, is that regardless of what the United States wants to do, imposing a cold war or a hot war, or both hot and cold, or a fever, or a trade war, or a tariff war, China refuses to be dragged into it. What China wants to do is to promote peace. And China now is already the champion of defending free trade and is a stalwart weight promoting freedom and promoting peace. So we are lucky because there is one country where I came from which refuses the Cold War or the Hot War, and we believe only in the inevitability of peace. In that sense, I kind of share my views more with the opposition side. So it's a kind of a split of personality or split of my loyalty. But I'm ready to take that risk because what I want to advocate is the inevitability of peace.
看大佬辩论真的太爽了，不仅逻辑满分，而且极其应景。最让我佩服的就是高志凯那种乱云飞渡人从容的底气。现在白宫深陷泥潭，一边是轰炸机，另一边又得想着怎么稳住中美关系。高志凯那句单向的冷战说得太绝了，你打你的热战，我搞我的和平。在别人发高烧失去理智的时候保持清醒，坚持做全球自由贸易的压舱石，这才是大国该有的战略智慧。这个世界不需要更多的炮火，我们需要的是降温。现在中东的战火已经让全球神经紧绷，如果中美两个核大国再按照哈佛专家的剧本走向对抗，那对全人类都是灾难。高志凯用一句中国拒绝被拖入任何热战或冷战，狠狠戳破了西方的霸权叙事。他告诉全世界，不是我们不敢打，而是我们知道和平才是唯一的出路。在这个疯狂的世界里，能有这样一个坚持不发烧不发疯致力于维系全球和平的国家，是我们所有人的幸运。大家觉得呢？